100,000 people from over 50 countries, accused, ripped from their lives, and murdered. What did these people do to deserve such a fate? They were said to be witches. To the people of post-medieval Europe, witches were seen as a threat and a poison that unleashed an unholy plague upon society. Witch hunting first took its root during the Black Death, when many people believed there were those who could bring the sickness. They called them plague spreaders, and if they had a grudge against you, then you or a family member would fall deathly ill with the plague. The trials increased steadily until the Catholic Reformation, when they began to decrease slowly in number. From 1450 to 1750, witches were put on trial and executed for their crimes against the Lord. The years that were the most intense were those surrounding 1550, and they were known to the people of Europe as the Burning Times, because the number of trials was huge in number. Witch hunts resulted in trials and executions of over 100,000 victims, 3/4 of them being women. The number of witch trials reduced after the 1650s in Europe, and they were gone almost completely by the end of the 1700s. Leading countries that so heavily participated in this witch craze, as it began to be called, executed over 1,000 each. Some killed up to 50,000. These countries included the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, France, Poland, Scotland, England, Scandinavia, Switzerland, and Hungary. History tells us that many of these accused and executed witches were innocent. Men were also not responsible for many of the accusations made. Most accusations were made by women, and the toll of persecuted witches was much higher in areas of Protestant and Catholicism, due to the strictness of the religious laws. The witch hunts also lost momentum after the 30 Years' War, which gave recognition to the religious freedoms. So what was the cause of this obsession with exterminating all witch traces from the 16th through the 18th centuries? Some of the main causes included economic stress, a high rate of unemployment, high elderly population, and for the purposes of political gain. Most people placed witches into a common stereotype, although many other people could be and were accused. Many supposed witches were elderly or lived alone, or were young women with children. The solid majority of witches was over 50 years of age. Many were accused and executed under the pretense that they looked like a witch. The fear of witches was so great that people placed a great deal of emphasis on a witch's appearance. There is also no historical evidence that the majority of witches were healers or midwives, as is commonly suspected, although those who were often were suspected of working with the devil as part of their jobs. The most common feature of a witch was the devil's mark, which was usually a mole or a birthmark, which signified a pact made with the devil. This was searched for by the town witch prickers, who looked for the mark and presented its evidence before the people. If the mark bled, they were human, but if it withheld blood, then it most certainly meant that the pricked person was a witch. Out of all convicted witches, 70 to 80% were female, but there were also many male accused witches. In France, over 1,300 witch trials were placed before Parliament. Over half of the cases concerned men. In some cases, men made up the majority of the accused. They made up 90% in Ireland, 60% in Estonia, and 50% in Finland. But in other places, they made up less than 10%. Another important witch hunter in town was the Inquisitor, who was in charge of seeking out witches and proving their guilt or innocence. They often used so-called high-tech tools to find the witches in town, such as a spinner placed on a stand which, once spun, would stop on a townsperson who had dealt with evil crimes of witchcraft. They had a handbook which they based much of their decisions on, the Malleus Maleficarum. This book was one of the most infamous books of that time, and became very popular among witch hunters after its first publication in the Middle Ages. It contained 3 main parts. The first part asked questions to secure the identity of a witch, including information about the devil, witches, and God. The second part gave information on how to cure the damage of witchcraft in the community, and the third part told how to try and execute a witch once they had been discovered. This book was owned by most of the Inquisitors, and was their most used tool to discovering witches. The Inquisitors were also paid by how many witches they caught and could rid the town of, so many of them found innocents who were easy prey, and and set them up as witches so they could make their money. Over the course of history, many obvious non-witches were tried for witchcraft, including a 3-week-old baby, a log, and many little children who had learning disabilities or who were different from the others. They used several methods of proving cases of witchcraft were valid. The pricking of a witch was one such method. Others included witch confessions, floating trials, and the words of witnesses. Those accused were often tortured into admitting their witch ways, even if they were completely innocent. They felt that the only way to stop the torture was to admit to a crime they were not guilty of. They also made many witches take the test of the water. They threw the accused into a river or lake or ocean and waited to see what would happen. If the person drowned, they were declared innocent. If they floated, they were announced a witch, having used their devilish ways to survive the clutches of death. They were also automatically labeled as a witch if they renounced their baptism. Other times, courts and townspeople used the words of witnesses to convict the accused witch. Many people came forth with so-called evidence about the witch that would aid in their destruction. In several recorded cases, while the witch was on trial, girls would become ailed with illnesses and begin to shiver violently whenever the accused turned their eyes upon them. A case in North America tells the tale of a group of girls who could feel the spirit of the devil within witches. They accused and executed many witches because they claimed they could discover them if they just set their eyes upon them. But their reign of power came to an end when the girls began becoming too sure of themselves and accusing high-ranking people such as the pastor and judges and other people in high influence within society. They were found out as frauds, but in their craze, many innocent people died. Other people tell judges about how their crops were suffering that year because of the presence of the witch in question. These witnesses were generally believed, and a witness against you usually meant a trip to the news or to another method of execution. Torture of a witch was common in many places and led to a witch's confession more times than not. Some types of torture included branding with hot irons, whips, and steel pincers. Tortures often led to the result the witch hunters were looking for. If the torture was successful, there was soon to be a public execution of the newly convicted witch. There was a standard procedure for the execution of a witch, and was usually followed in similar ways across Europe. The witch in question was brought before the investigating tribunal and was interrogated. For some places, torture was used heavily in this step of the process. Most who confessed only did so after large amounts of brutal torture. Half of all convicted witches were given sentences that were short of execution, while the other half were burned or executed in public. There were also different ways of execution. The most recognized type of execution for witch trials was the burning, but other methods were used. For example, England hung witches rather than burned them, and each country had individualized methods of getting rid of a witch. This tragic time in history affected everyone, whether they were accused of witchcraft or not. The families of those executed often could not find decent jobs based on the fact that their relation had betrayed the Lord by committing the sin of witchcraft. The burnings and executions of witches were town-wide events and were often the main entertainment of the town. Thousands of people were impacted by this tragedy, which destroyed lives, jobs, and the ways of life of the accused and their families.
Fire burn within me, kindled from eternal fire. All the people that I see, all the people part of me. One flame, many parts, a simple fire flaming. Fire burn within me, kindled from eternal fire. All the people that I see, all the people part of me. All the people that I see, parts, a simple fire flaming. One flame, many parts, a simple fire flaming. Fire burn within me, kindled from eternal fire. All the people that I see, all the people part of me. One flame, many parts, a simple fire.